It was a warm, peaceful morning, the kind that made the sky look soft and the roads seem endless under the early sunlight. Daniel, a quiet man in his mid-30s, had just finished his long night shift at the furniture factory. His back hurt, his eyes were tired, and all he wanted was to reach home, shower, and sleep. He drove slowly on the deserted countryside road, keeping his windows slightly open to feel the cool morning breeze. Usually, nothing surprising ever happened on his way home. Life was predictable, simple, almost silent. But this morning was different. As he approached a narrow bend, he noticed something lying near the edge of the road, something so small and still that he almost missed it. At first, he thought it was a crushed piece of cloth or maybe trash someone had thrown out. But then it moved. Only a little, but enough for Daniel to press the brakes gently and bring his car to a stop. Curiosity pushed away his tiredness. He stepped out of the car, walking slowly toward the tiny creature. The sunlight made the dew sparkle on the grass, and the world felt strangely quiet, as though holding its breath. When he got close enough, he finally saw it, a tiny, trembling ball of fur. It was so small that both of Daniel's hands together could easily hold it. The little creature tried to lift its head but failed. Its body shook from cold, fear, or weakness, maybe all three. Daniel knelt beside it and whispered, "Hey, easy. I'm not going to hurt you." He didn't want to startle it. The creature's eyes were half closed, and its breathing was faint, almost like it was fading away. The sight made Daniel's heart tighten. He knew someone must have abandoned it, or its mother was gone. Whatever the story was, this helpless little life had no chance of survival alone. Daniel slowly reached out and touched the soft fur. It felt fragile, like touching something that could break with too much pressure. The creature let out a tiny whimper, a sound so weak yet full of pain that Daniel knew he couldn't walk away. He gently slid his jacket off and wrapped the small body inside it, creating a warm pocket. To his surprise, the creature curled into his chest, as if seeking safety. Its tiny paws pressed lightly against him, and he felt a strange, sudden connection, a feeling he couldn't explain, as though life had placed this moment in front of him for a reason. He whispered, "It's okay, I've got you now," and carried it back to his car. Inside the car, he turned on the heater and carefully placed the tiny creature on the passenger seat, still wrapped in his jacket. The little furball looked like a newborn puppy, weak and abandoned. Daniel had never owned a pet, but he always liked dogs, and seeing this tiny life struggle stirred something protective inside him. As he continued driving, the creature's breathing grew steadier, but it still looked exhausted, like it was fighting a battle it had almost lost. Daniel kept glancing at it between driving, his heart filled with worrying and hope at the same time. The road felt longer than usual, each minute stretching like an hour as he wondered what he should do next. He knew he needed to take it to a vet. That was the right thing. But first, he decided to stop at a small roadside cafe he visited every morning for coffee, thinking maybe he could find something gentle to feed the little creature. When Daniel walked into the cafe, the warm smell of fresh bread and coffee welcomed him. The owner, Mrs. Carter, a cheerful woman in her 50s, noticed the bundle in his arms immediately. "Oh my goodness," she said, rushing toward him. "Is that a puppy?" Daniel nodded, though he wasn't fully sure himself. "Found him on the road." Poor thing's freezing. The cafe customers turned their heads, their faces softening as they saw the tiny creature peeking from the jacket. Mrs. Carter quickly brought a small bowl of warm milk. "Try giving him a little," she said. Daniel sat at a corner table, holding the creature carefully in one arm, while dipping his finger into the milk and letting it lick slowly. The first few attempts were weak, but soon the tiny mouth began to accept the milk, drop by drop. A small ripple of relief washed over Daniel's chest. People walked by, smiling, praising his kindness. Some even took pictures, thinking it was a heart-touching moment of a man saving a stray puppy. The more Daniel fed it, the more the creature pressed against his palm, seeking warmth and maybe comfort. A gentle bond formed, unexpected but powerful. This simple act of kindness made Daniel feel important again, something he hadn't felt in a long time. His life was ordinary, quiet, and sometimes lonely. But now, as he held the tiny creature, he felt meaningful, connected, like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He looked at it and whispered, "I think I'll call you Scout." The little creature didn't move much, but for a moment, its eyes opened just slightly, enough for Daniel to feel like it understood. After feeding it, warming it, and watching it breathe more steadily, Daniel knew it was time to take Scout to the vet. He wanted to make sure the puppy was healthy, safe, and cared for properly. He gently wrapped it again, thanked Mrs. Carter, and walked out into the golden morning sunlight. The day had started like any other, but now Daniel felt something unusual and emotional pull. A sense of responsibility, a strange feeling that saving this tiny creature was more than just chance. He couldn't imagine that the real journey was just beginning, and nothing about Scout was as simple as it appeared. Soon, he would learn the shocking truth that would freeze him in place and change everything he thought he knew. Asterisk as Daniel drove away from the cafe with the tiny creature wrapped safely in his jacket, he felt an unusual sense of protectiveness rising inside him, a feeling he had not experienced in years. The morning sun painted the road with soft golden light, making everything look peaceful. But Daniel's mind was racing with worrying and responsibility. Every now and then, he would glance at the small bundle lying on the passenger seat, watching the way it moved its tiny paws gently as if searching for warmth. The creature looked even smaller now that it was resting, its fragile body curled tightly, its eyes barely open, showing a world filled with fear and confusion. Daniel reached over with one hand and lightly brushed his fingers over its soft fur, feeling the way it leaned into his touch as though it had already chosen him as its protector. He whispered softly, "Don't worry, little one. We're going to get you checked." And those words carried a promise he wasn't even sure he could fulfill. But he meant them with his whole heart. The car interior felt strangely warm, not because of the heater, but because of the bond that had begun forming between a tired man and a helpless creature who seemed to understand nothing but need and comfort. During the drive, memories of Daniel's lonely life crossed his mind. After losing his father 2 years earlier and living alone in a small rented apartment, his days had blended into a quiet routine: work, home, sleep, repeat. There was no laughter, no excitement, no one waiting for him. Yet now, with Scout lying beside him, he felt a small spark return to his heart. He imagined what life might be like if the little creature survived, if it became his companion, if they built a small world together. The thought made him smile in a way he had not smiled in a long time. The creature lifted its head weakly and let out a tiny sound, something between a whimper and a squeak, and Daniel's heart softened even more. "You're stronger than you look," he murmured, adjusting the jacket around it to make sure it stayed warm. He drove more carefully than he ever had, avoiding bumps, slowing down for turns, terrified that any sudden movement might hurt the fragile little life in his care. When he reached the vet's clinic, a small building at the corner of the town with glass windows and potted plants outside, he parked his car and held Scout close to his chest as he walked toward the entrance. The creature was so light that Daniel barely felt its weight, but he could feel its heartbeat, fast yet weakening, reminding him how urgent this visit was. Inside the clinic, the smell of medicine and disinfectant filled the air, and the soft sounds of animals waiting for treatment made the place feel alive. A receptionist noticed Daniel holding the bundle and quickly asked what was wrong. "I found him on the road," Daniel explained, his voice tense with worrying. "He's very weak. Please, can someone help?" The receptionist immediately called the vet, Dr. Myers, a calm man with silver hair and gentle eyes who had been treating animals in the town for over 30 years. Dr. Myers approached Daniel with a friendly smile, expecting to see another abandoned puppy in need of care. But when Daniel slowly opened the jacket to reveal the tiny creature inside, everything changed. The vet leaned in, his expression shifting from curiosity to confusion, and then to something Daniel couldn't read at all. He studied the small face, the pattern of its fur, the shape of its ears, its body proportions, details Daniel had not even considered. The vet's eyes widened slightly, and the color drained from his face. The warmth of the room seemed to disappear, replaced by a cold tension that made Daniel's stomach twist in fear. He felt his breath stop for a moment, and he asked, "Is something wrong?" But the vet did not answer immediately. Instead, he carried the creature to the examination table with an unusual urgency, his voice no longer calm, but sharp as he called for his assistant. Daniel followed, feeling confused, scared, and strangely protective. Scout stirred in the vet's hands, letting out a faint cry that made Daniel instinctively step forward, almost as if he feared the vet might accidentally harm it. The vet performed a quick examination, touching the creature's tiny paws, lifting its head slightly, checking its teeth, its eyes, its breathing, and each time he moved, his face grew more serious. Daniel felt his heart pounding against his ribs as suspense filled the air. He had no idea what could possibly be wrong. It looked like a puppy, small, helpless, innocent. What else could it be? After what felt like an eternity, the vet finally looked at Daniel, his expression a mixture of shock and caution. "Where exactly did you find this?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Daniel explained everything again: the roadside, the trembling creature, the cafe, the feedings, the drive here. He expected the vet to simply nod or reassure him, but instead, the vet exchanged a worried glance with his assistant. Something was clearly not normal. The vet took a deep breath, then placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder in a way that felt heavy and deliberate. "Daniel," he said slowly, "this is not a puppy." Those 5 words hit Daniel like a sudden, invisible blow. His mind froze, the world around him falling silent as he stared at the tiny creature he had just named, fed, warmed, and emotionally bonded with. His heart raced with fear and confusion, and he had no idea that what he was about to learn would change his day, his life, and everything he believed about the small creature that had already begun to change his heart. Daniel stood frozen beside the examination table, his mind spinning after hearing the vet's chilling words. "This is not a puppy," and he suddenly felt the room shrink around him as an uneasy silence filled every corner of the clinic, making even the humming of the air conditioner sound distant and eerie. Dr. Meyer's face, usually calm and comforting, now carried a tightness that made Daniel's stomach twist painfully, and the vet's assistant hovered nearby with a tense look, as though whatever they had discovered was far more serious than a misidentified animal. Daniel watched helplessly as the vet examined the small creature a second time, this time with more urgency, checking the shape of the nose, the pattern of the fur, the structure of the paws, and each detail seemed to deepen the concern etched across his face. Scout let out a faint whimper, reaching its tiny paw toward Daniel, and the sight made his heart ache, pushing him to step closer as if he needed to shield the fragile creature from the unknown truth. "What is it then?" Daniel finally asked, his voice trembling with fear he couldn't hide anymore, his palms sweating and his breath coming slower and heavier as the suspense grew unbearable. Dr. Myers glanced at him with eyes full of something Daniel couldn't interpret: fear, disbelief, and responsibility all mixed together, and the vet took a long breath before speaking, as though choosing the right words to soften a revelation that would hit like a storm. He explained that the creature's features didn't match that of any domestic puppy. Instead, it resembled something far rarer, something wild, something that didn't belong on a roadside or in a man's jacket. The vet turned the creature gently, revealing small traits Daniel had never noticed: the unusual fur markings, the sharper nails, the distinct bone structure, and slowly said, "Daniel, you didn't rescue a puppy, you rescued a newborn wolf cub." The words echoed in Daniel's mind like thunder, leaving him stunned, confused, and breathless as he stared at the tiny creature that looked harmless but was suddenly part of a world he knew nothing about. He tried to process the vet's explanation, but his thoughts tangled into knots. To him, Scout looked like nothing more than a weak baby dog needing love, warmth, and safety. Yet now he realized he had been feeding and caring a wild animal, one that should have been deep inside the forest with its pack instead of lying on a roadside waiting for anyone to stumble upon it. The vet continued speaking, explaining that wolf cubs rarely survive without their pack, and that this one must have been separated somehow, maybe during a storm or a hunt. Or perhaps its mother had been scared away, leaving the newborn vulnerable and alone. Daniel felt a heavy guilt press onto his chest, not because he had done anything wrong, but because he now understood how fragile the situation truly was. Scout was not just lost, it was endangered, its survival depending on decisions far bigger than Daniel had ever imagined making. The vet warned him that according to wildlife laws, authorities needed to be informed immediately, but before Daniel could panic, Dr. Myers also assured him that his actions had likely saved the cub's life, and without his intervention, Scout would not have survived the cold morning. Still, the reality felt overwhelming, and Daniel's head throbbed with the weight of a responsibility he had never asked for, but now felt deeply attached to Dot as the vet finished his examination. A sudden shift filled the clinic, a mix of urgency and caution, as if everyone understood that this small creature was far more significant than anyone first believed. The receptionist whispered quietly to the assistant. Customers waiting in the lobby leaned forward trying to catch bits of conversation, and Daniel felt dozens of eyes watching him, curious about the man who had unknowingly walked in holding a rare Wolf Cub in his arms. The vet made several phone calls, speaking in low tones, mentioning wildlife rescue teams, forest officers, and medical protocols for handling such a young cub. Each word made Daniel's anxiety grow, but also deepened the strange connection he felt towards Scout, who still reached for him, still responded to his voice even though it was a wild animal by nature. When the vet finished, he approached Daniel gently and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, telling him that the wildlife team would arrive soon and that they would need Daniel's help to explain where and how he found the cub so they could search for its pack. But before any of that, the cub needed warmth, hydration, and careful monitoring, all of which the vet promised to handle. Daniel exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself, his thoughts shifting back and forth between fear and determination. He did not regret stopping on the road, nor did he regret holding the tiny creature close and trying to save its life. If anything, he felt more protective now, knowing just how vulnerable Scout was. The vet allowed Daniel to sit beside the cub while they prepared medical equipment, and as he sat there, the Wolf Cub blinked weakly and pressed its tiny head against Daniel's fingers. That moment broke through all the fear and replaced it with something stronger: resolve. Daniel whispered, "I'm here, little one. I'm not going anywhere." And though the vet glanced at him with concern, he could see that Daniel's heart had already accepted the unexpected truth. What began as a simple act of kindness on a quiet morning had now become a journey into the unknown, a path filled with surprises, responsibilities, and challenges Daniel never imagined he would face. But he didn't shy away. He held onto Scout gently, unaware that the bond they were forming, man and Wolf, would soon lead him into a series of events more emotional, more dangerous, and more life-changing than anything he had ever known. The moment Dr. Myers revealed that Scout was a newborn Wolf Cub, the air inside the clinic changed, as though an invisible curtain had fallen between the familiar and the unknown, and Daniel felt the weight of that revelation settle on his chest like a cold stone, making him swallow hard as he stared at the tiny creature that he had already begun to love. The vet continued explaining that the cub, judging by its fragile size and unopened ears, was no more than a few days old, and the chances of a Wolf this young surviving alone were almost zero, which made Daniel realize just how close this little life had come to death on that lonely road. The more the vet talked, the more Daniel understood that finding Scout had not been some random accident. It was a life-or-death moment disguised in the shape of a helpless creature wrapped in a jacket. The vet gently placed the cub under a warming lamp, and Daniel watched as the tiny chest rose and fell unevenly, making him feel both protective and terrified, because he now knew that the responsibility he had taken on was far greater than he had ever imagined. People in the waiting area whispered loudly, shocked that the cute puppy they had admired earlier was actually a wild animal. And although many reactions were filled with curiosity and surprise, Daniel felt their eyes on him as though he were part of something unusual, something bigger than himself. He wished he could explain that he hadn't been seeking attention or trying to do anything remarkable. He had simply followed his heart, and that single choice had led him to this moment filled with questions he never thought he would face in his simple, lonely life. Dr. Myers explained softly that wolf packs are deeply protective and rarely leave their young behind unless something dangerous or traumatic forces them to flee. And those words made Daniel feel a sudden ache in his chest as he imagined a frantic mother wolf searching for her missing babe, maybe somewhere deep in the woods, unaware that the cub was now lying under warm lights in a human clinic. The vet added that a search team would need to look for the pack, and the cub would require expert care until then. "You may have saved an entire species' bloodline," the vet said, his voice carrying respect. And for a moment Daniel felt his breath catch, because he had never thought of himself as someone capable of making a difference. Not in the world, not even in his own life. He glanced at the tiny wolf, small, trembling, yet strong enough to survive, until he found it and felt a strange mixture of pride, fear, and wonder swirl inside him. The cub's small paws curled gently against the cloth beneath it, and Daniel couldn't stop staring at it because the little creature represented a delicate balance between the wild and the vulnerable. A reminder that life could place extraordinary moments in ordinary hands without any warning. Suddenly, the clinic door opened and 2 wildlife officers stepped in, wearing uniforms with forest emblems on their sleeves. They approached the vet with serious expressions, talking in low voices about regulations, survival chances, and the nearest wolf pack sightings. Daniel listened, feeling both included and out of place, as though he had been dropped into a world he didn't understand, yet somehow had become an important part of. One of the officers asked him to describe exactly where he found the cub, and as he repeated the story again, he felt the memory sharpen in his mind: the quiet road, the trembling fur, the helpless eyes, moments that had seemed simple earlier but now felt monumental. The officer nodded thoughtfully and mentioned that there had been a report of a disrupted wolf den not far from that area, possibly caused by construction or loud machinery in the forest, which might have scattered the pack. Daniel felt a sudden rush of worrying, imagining the cub's family wandering through the woods, searching, calling, perhaps grieving. The officers explained that young wolves imprint through scent and sound, and the cub might still recognize its mother if they could locate the pack in time. The idea filled Daniel with both hope and fear. He wanted Scout to survive, but he also felt a sting of sadness at the thought of letting the cub go, as though he were already losing something precious he never truly owned. As the officers examined Scout, the cub suddenly moved its tiny head toward Daniel and made a soft, weak sound that echoed like a plea. And Dr. Myers noticed the way the cub responded to Daniel's presence. "It trusts you," the vet said gently, almost surprised by the depth of connection between man and wolf. And Daniel felt his throat tighten, because even though Scout was not a puppy, not a domestic pet, not something he could truly keep, the bond between them was real and undeniable. That small moment, the cub reaching out to him, carved itself into Daniel's heart in a way he knew he would never forget. The vet then informed the wildlife team that the cub needed warmth and feeding on a strict schedule, and the officers agreed to transport it to a specialized wildlife care facility. But before they took Scout away, they allowed Daniel to hold it one last time. As he cradled the tiny wolf, its soft fur warming under his touch, he felt the same fragile heartbeat against his chest that he had felt on the roadside, and a deep sadness washed over him, mixed with pride and wonder at how such a tiny life had changed his entire view of the world within just a few hours. The cub pressed its nose lightly against Daniel's hand, and in that instant, he realized that nature had trusted him with something rare and delicate. The officers gently took the cub and secured it in a protective carrier, and Daniel watched with heavy eyes but a grateful heart, knowing he had done everything he could. As the wildlife team prepared to leave, the vet told Daniel that he would be contacted with updates, and perhaps even invited to join the team when they attempted to reunite the cub with its pack. The idea surprised Daniel, yet warmed him deeply. Even if Scout was not his to keep, he felt responsible for seeing the journey through. As the door closed behind the officers, carrying Scout into the next chapter of its fragile life, Daniel stood there feeling changed. Not in a dramatic, heroic way, but in a quiet, meaningful way, as if the world had whispered a secret to him, reminding him that compassion, even small acts of it, had the power to reach places he never imagined. He walked out of the clinic slowly, the morning sunlight brighter now, the world feeling larger and more alive than ever before, unaware that his involvement with the tiny wolf cub was far from over, and the next steps would lead him deeper into the wilderness, into danger, and into a story far more powerful than anything he had ever lived. The cub's small paws curled gently against the cloth beneath it, and Daniel couldn't stop staring at it, because the little creature represented a delicate balance between the wild and the vulnerable. A reminder that life could place extraordinary moments in ordinary hands without any warning. Suddenly, the clinic door opened and 2 wildlife officers stepped in, wearing uniforms with forest emblems on their sleeves. They approached the vet with serious expressions, talking in low voices about regulations, survival chances, and the nearest wolf pack sightings. Daniel listened, feeling both included and out of place, as though he had been dropped into a world he didn't understand, yet somehow had become an important part of. One of the officers asked him to describe exactly where he found the cub, and as he repeated the story again, he felt the memory sharpen in his mind: the quiet road, the trembling fur, the helpless eyes, moments that had seemed simple earlier but now felt monumental. The officer nodded thoughtfully and mentioned that there had been a report of a disrupted wolf den not far from that area, possibly caused by construction or loud machinery in the forest, which might have scattered the pack. Daniel felt a sudden rush of worrying, imagining the cub's family wandering through the woods, searching, calling, perhaps grieving. The officers explained that young wolves imprint through scent and sound, and the cub might still recognize its mother if they could locate the pack in time. The idea filled Daniel with both hope and fear. He wanted Scout to survive, but he also felt a sting of sadness at the thought of letting the cub go, as though he were already losing something precious he never truly owned. As the officers examined Scout, the cub suddenly moved its tiny head toward Daniel and made a soft, weak sound that echoed like a plea. And Dr. Myers noticed the way the cub responded to Daniel's presence. "It trusts you," the vet said gently, almost surprised by the depth of connection between man and wolf. And Daniel felt his throat tighten, because even though Scout was not a puppy, not a domestic pet, not something he could truly keep, the bond between them was real and undeniable. That small moment, the cub reaching out to him, carved itself into Daniel's heart in a way he knew he would never forget. The vet then informed the wildlife team that the cub needed warmth and feeding on a strict schedule, and the officers agreed to transport it to a specialized wildlife care facility. But before they took Scout away, they allowed Daniel to hold it one last time. As he cradled the tiny wolf, its soft fur warming under his touch, he felt the same fragile heartbeat against his chest that he had felt on the roadside, and a deep sadness washed over him, mixed with pride and wonder at how such a tiny life had changed his entire view of the world within just a few hours. The cub pressed its nose lightly against Daniel's hand, and in that instant, he realized that nature had trusted him with something rare and delicate. The officers gently took the cub and secured it in a protective carrier, and Daniel watched with heavy eyes but a grateful heart, knowing he had done everything he could. As the wildlife team prepared to leave, the vet told Daniel that he would be contacted with updates, and perhaps even invited to join the team when they attempted to reunite the cub with its pack. The idea surprised Daniel, yet warmed him deeply. Even if Scout was not his to keep, he felt responsible for seeing the journey through. As the door closed behind the officers, carrying Scout into the next chapter of its fragile life, Daniel stood there feeling changed. Not in a dramatic, heroic way, but in a quiet, meaningful way, as if the world had whispered a secret to him, reminding him that compassion, even small acts of it, had the power to reach places he never imagined. He walked out of the clinic slowly, the morning sunlight brighter now, the world feeling larger and more alive than ever before, unaware that his involvement with the tiny wolf cub was far from over, and the next steps would lead him deeper into the wilderness, into danger, and into a story far more powerful than anything he had ever lived. The following morning arrived with a strange mixture of nervous excitement and heavy responsibility for Daniel, who barely slept after learning that Scout had been taken to a wildlife rehabilitation center, and now he stood at the forest's edge beside the wildlife officers, his heart pounding with a rhythm he had never felt before, knowing that today they would attempt something incredibly delicate and dangerous, reuniting the newborn wolf cub with its pack. The forest stretched before them like a vast green ocean, full of shadows and whispers, alive with sounds of birds and leaves and unseen creatures moving through the underbrush. And although it was daytime, the place felt mysterious and unpredictable. The officers explained that wolf packs were extremely protective of their young, and approaching them could trigger aggressive behavior if the pack sensed danger. But if they recognized the cub's scent and cry, there was a strong chance they would accept it again. Daniel listened carefully, absorbing every word, trying to push away the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. He wasn't a trained rescuer, he wasn't brave by nature, but something inside him urged him forward. This wasn't just about returning a wolf cub to its family. It felt like completing a promise he made the moment he picked Scout up from the cold road. When they opened the carrier box and Daniel saw Scout again, small, fragile, with eyes now open slightly wider, his heart tightened in a way he couldn't describe. The cub recognized him instantly, letting out a soft cry that made everyone pause and glance at him. Dr. Myers, who had joined them for the mission, whispered quietly that the cub had responded most positively to Daniel during the night as well. That simple truth made Daniel feel both proud and scared, because he realized that Scout's trust in him came with an enormous responsibility, one he wasn't sure he truly deserved, but one he was determined to honor. The journey into the forest was harder than Daniel had expected. The terrain was uneven, full of slippery rocks, thick roots, and tall bushes that brushed against their legs, leaving scratches. The officers moved with practiced ease, but Daniel stumbled occasionally, trying to balance caution and determination as he followed them deeper into the woods. They carried Scout carefully, wrapped in a soft cloth, but every time the cub whimpered, Daniel's heart jumped in fear that it might be hurt or cold or simply longing for comfort. After nearly an hour of walking, they reached the area where the disrupted den had been reported. It was a quiet clearing surrounded by dense trees, with signs of disturbance, broken branches, scattered dry leaves, and faint tracks pressed into the soil that looked like a mixture of adult wolf prints and the lighter, smaller steps of cubs. One of the officers crouched down and studied the tracks, explaining that the pack seemed to have moved recently but was likely still nearby, possibly watching them from the trees. That thought sent a shiver across Daniel's skin, not because he feared the wolves, but because he imagined how terrified the mother must be, sensing humans near her territory while she searched for her missing baby. The officers placed Scout gently on a soft patch of moss near the center of the clearing and stepped back slowly, allowing the cub's natural scent to spread through the air. Daniel remained a few steps closer than the others, unable to walk away fully, his eyes glued to the tiny wolf, who struggled to lift its head and let out faint cries that echoed through the forest like a delicate plea for help. Minutes passed, long and suspenseful, each second stretching into eternity as Daniel listened to the subtle rustle of leaves, the distant crack of twigs, and the deep, almost unnoticeable growl carried by the whine sounds that hinted that something large and cautious was approaching. Suddenly, one of the officers raised his hand, signaling for everyone to stay still and silent. Daniel held his breath, his heart thumping like a drum inside his chest, and then he saw a shadow moving between the trees. Slow, graceful, and powerful, a massive gray wolf stepped into the clearing, its eyes sharp and intelligent, scanning everything with a mixture of suspicion and fear. Daniel felt the world narrow to that one moment, everything else fading away as he watched the wolf's gaze land on the small cub lying on the ground. The mother wolf, for there was no mistaking the raw emotion shining in her eyes, moved closer with cautious steps, her body tense, ready to defend or attack depending on what she sensed from the humans surrounding her. Scout let out a weak cry, and the sound broke something inside the wolf. She rushed forward suddenly, lowering her head and sniffing the cub repeatedly, her movements a blend of love, desperation, and relief. Daniel's eyes stung with tears as he watched the mother nuzzle her baby gently, licking its fur, encouraging it to respond. And though the cub was weak, it lifted its head and made a soft sound in return, a small but powerful moment of recognition that filled the clearing with an emotion too pure to describe. The wildlife officers stood ready in case the wolf reacted aggressively, but instead, she turned her head toward Daniel, fixing her intense yellow on him with a look so deep and expressive that it rooted him to the ground. It wasn't anger or fear, it was something closer to acknowledgement, as though she understood that this man had saved her child. Daniel felt a strange warmth fill his chest as he held her gaze, recognizing that he had become a small, unexpected part of this wild creature's story. The mother wolf gently picked up the cub by the scruff of its neck, preparing to carry it back to the safety of her pack, and Daniel watched with a mixture of joy and sorrow, knowing this was the right thing, even though it tugged painfully at his heart. Before disappearing into the trees, the wolf paused one more time, turning back toward Daniel, giving him a long, silent look that felt almost like gratitude. And then she vanished into the forest, carrying Scout away into the life he was meant to live. Daniel stood there in the quiet clearing, feeling the sun warm his face and the wind brush softly against his skin, realizing he had just witnessed something rare, something sacred, something that didn't happen to ordinary people. And though Scout was gone, the bond they had shared in such a short time left a permanent mark on his heart, filling him with a sense of purpose, strength, and wonder he never knew he possessed. In the days that followed the emotional reunion between Scout and his mother, Daniel found himself walking through his life with a sense of quiet wonder he had never experienced before, as though something inside him had shifted permanently, opening a new doorway to a deeper understanding of compassion, responsibility, and the strange ways life connects people to moments they never expect. Every morning, as he woke up and prepared for work, he found his thoughts drifting back to that clearing in the woods, to the sight of the mother wolf emerging from the shadows, to the soft whimper of the tiny cub recognizing its family, and to the silent look she gave him before disappearing into the forest, a look that carried a message words could never express. Daniel had spent years feeling like his life was ordinary, invisible, and predictable, but now he realized that even ordinary people could find themselves in extraordinary situations when they simply follow their heart. The story of the man who rescued a puppy that turned out to be a wolf cub spread across town, through social media, and even through a local news channel. And although the attention made Daniel shy and slightly uncomfortable, he also felt a warm sense of pride, knowing that something he did out of pure kindness was inspiring others to care more deeply for animals and the world around them. Children drew pictures of him holding Scout. Teachers told the story in classrooms to teach empathy, and strangers approached him at the grocery store just to shake his hand and say, "You did something beautiful." But the attention faded. Over time, as all news eventually does, and life returned to its calm rhythm, yet Daniel remained changed, carrying the memory of that morning like a quiet flame inside his heart. Weeks later, on a peaceful afternoon when he had finished work early, Daniel decided to visit the forest again, not to search for Scout or disturb the wildlife, but simply to walk the path where everything had begun, to feel the silence of nature, and to remind himself of the small miracle he had been part of. The forest looked different now, greener, brighter, alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, and the sunlight filtering through the branches painted warm golden patterns on the ground as he walked deeper into the familiar path. The air smelled of pine and earth, soothing him in a way no city noise ever could, and he found himself smiling softly as he remembered how terrified he had been the day he stepped into these woods with the wildlife officers. As he reached the clearing where they had returned Scout to his mother, he stopped and took a slow breath, letting the memories flood his mind. The place felt peaceful, untouched, almost sacred, and Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, whispering a silent thank you for the experience that had changed his life. He didn't expect to see anything unusual. He simply wanted to stand there for a moment, to acknowledge the journey and the bond he had formed with a creature that belonged to the wild. Just as he turned to leave, a soft rustling sound reached his ears, faint but distinct, like something moving carefully through the bushes. Daniel froze, his heart skipping a beat, not out of fear, but out of a strange, inexplicable hope. He slowly turned his head toward the trees, scanning the shadows between the branches, and then he saw her, the same gray mother wolf, standing tall, poised, and majestic at the edge of the clearing. Her fur glistened under the sunlight, her eyes sharp and golden, and for a long moment she didn't move, simply watching him with the same calm intensity she had shown on the day of the reunion. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as their eyes met again, and this time there was no fear, no tension, only a silent understanding that passed between them like a quiet echo of gratitude. Behind her, he noticed a smaller shape, a young cub, a little stronger, a little larger, its fur brighter and its eyes curious. Scout. He recognized the tiny tilt of its head, the gentle way it stood close to its mother for safety, and the sight filled his chest with warmth so deep that tears gathered in the corners of his eyes. The mother wolf didn't growl or step forward. She simply stood still, as though presenting her cub to Daniel, acknowledging him as someone who had played a small but vital role in its survival. Daniel felt a soft smile spread across his face, and although he made no move to approach them, he placed his hand gently over his heart, a gesture of respect, understanding, and gratitude. Scout took a few tiny steps forward, not close enough to break the natural boundary between human and wild, but far enough to show recognition, as if remembering the warmth of Daniel's jacket and the gentle hands that had saved him on that cold morning. For a few silent seconds, the three stood in a delicate triangle of connection: man, mother wolf, and wolf cub, bound not by ownership or control, but by a shared story of survival and kindness. Then, as quietly as she had appeared, the mother wolf turned back into the forest, her cub following close beside her, disappearing into the shadows with the grace of something that belonged to another world. Daniel watched until the last rustle of leaves faded, then released a slow breath, feeling lighter, stronger, and strangely complete, as though life itself had given him a rare gift, one that could never be repeated but would stay with him forever. Walking back toward the road, Daniel realized that the world had not changed. It was still full of challenges, routines, and quiet days. But he had changed. He carried a new understanding now that kindness, even the smallest act of it, had the power to reach places he could not see, touching lives he would never fully understand, sometimes even stretching into the wild beyond human language. He knew that rescuing Scout had not just saved a wolf cub. It had awakened something inside him, healed a loneliness he had carried for years, and reminded him that life still held beautiful surprises. As he reached his car and took one last look at the forest behind him, Daniel whispered softly, "Thank you," not to anyone in particular, but to the moment, the journey, and the story that had chosen him. With a calm heart and a renewed sense of purpose, he drove away, knowing that he would never forget the helpless little creature he once thought was a puppy, the truth that shocked him, and the wild, unforgettable friendship that changed his life forever.